That gold-embossed invitation, sealed with a smug little wax stamp, was for Myra's wedding, which I was never intended to attend. It was a cleverly wrapped landmine, camouflaged as closure, not a bridge. The moment I opened the envelope, I felt it in the pit of my stomach. It had that feeling of finality, but not tranquility. And like an idiot waiting for a wound to reopen, I came. Not to win. I came for closure. I reminded myself, this is closure. So I told her not to smile graciously, told her to go on. I told myself all the lies I could until I convinced myself enough to put on a suit. Because I was over her. I know. Because I initially counted, I'd been divorced for 11 months, 2 weeks, and 5 days. Because it didn't stop matching spoilers. Because it made me angry later, wondering whether she was getting married to perfect Julian Cross. Myra's new persona had a face made for magazine covers, a trust fund that rivaled tiny nations, and the charm of a man who had never been told no. The type of man who didn't simply enter a room, he changed its atmosphere. And she had changed. From me to him. The location was a vineyard, but not just any vineyard. It seemed to Julian like the most logical step in the universe. The type of place where reservations were made 2 years in advance, and only if your family name appeared on old bank records. Inscribed and awarded outside the ceremonial venue, a museum with verdant hills stretching in all directions. It was a glass palace perched on a bluff, and if you could even call it that, the sunset struck it perfectly. It had been recruited to make the day seem flawless. Everyone wore hand-tailored suits, gowns, sparkling shoes. They murmured secrets as their wearers passed. It resembled a movie premiere more than a wedding, and I wasn't on the cast list. So, I stayed on the sidelines, let the conversations flow past me. I feigned looking at my phone. I wore a jacket despite the heat. I smiled when people glanced my way, and I nodded courteously. The conversation circled endlessly, and I hoped, prayed, that if anyone looked at me too long, they wouldn't ask what I did now. What I did for a living, because that was the secret I brought into that gilded palace. I wasn't even prospering. Soon after Mira left, everything fell apart, in slow motion. The apartment got smaller, quieter, and then it disappeared. When? Her father stopped recommending me. Consulting gigs dried up. My LinkedIn still bore a title I hadn't earned in months. I did odd IT jobs, updating systems, running back-end patches, creating landing pages for businesses that didn't even list. They're founders, but I was unnamed and unkind. I headed to the open bar. Not because I drink. I usually don't. But something about the way everyone moved made me crave the sharp astringency of bourbon. The bartender, a young man with dental issues, poured liquor. Twice. I nodded when the glass met my lips. Noticed my palm was shaking. Not because I still loved Mira, but because I was among people who had never let me in. Then I saw her, standing by the floral arch, loudly, boldly, in front of their whole world. Before she noticed me. She gleamed, but not in that joyful bridal way. Mira wore the dress like it was part of her skin, acting joy, skilled at it. Her eyes, always practiced, her laughter, clear. She exuded intention. She stayed close to people long enough to appear warm. She moved like someone who knew she was being watched and wanted control. She turned, saw me. No surprise, no warmth, only calculation. She had expected me to show. Her lips curled into the half-smile she used when she knew something I didn't. So I raised my glass. Didn't wave. She gave a nod. Then looked away. Before I could process what her expression said, "You don't belong here." I couldn't leave. Not yet. Leaving now would give her too much satisfaction. It would validate her version of our story. So I leaned on a stone column, far from the spotlight, listened to the quartet transition from Pachelbel to a string rendition of Beyoncé. Sometimes people glanced at me like I was a waiter who had strayed too far from his tray. But I stayed. Maybe I was a masochist in cufflinks. Maybe I believed. This would bring closure. I didn't tell anyone, not even myself, that I hadn't really let her go. Servers moved past with trays of crab cakes and champagne. I stood under a twisted iron bridge, its fairy lights flickering above. Trying not to look like a guest, she found me. Of course she did. We locked eyes across the lawn. She approached with that same deliberate grace. What I once mistook for elegance, I now saw for what it was: precision. A mirror. Her dress shimmered in silver blue, diamonds in the moonlight. She was beautiful, sharp, a velvet rope behind glass. "Didn't expect you to actually show," she said too brightly. "Didn't expect to be invited," I replied, matching her tone. She narrowed her eyes. Just a little. She hated it when I didn't flinch. We stood, surrounded by people laughing, clinking glasses. Her jaw tightened. All she wanted, all she ever wanted, was prestige. And now she had. "Hey, now you get to see what a real wedding looks like," she added, throwing the words like confetti. She hadn't invited me for peace. She had invited me to cut, to show me how she'd upgraded, to sit me down and shrink me. I nodded. "It's wonderful," I said, and it was. But that wasn't the point. Her grin widened. She tasted my restraint. And she left, the gown trailing behind like the tail of a beast that devours softness. I went back to the bar. Not for the drink, for the distraction. People were noticing me now. Not for who I was, but for who I used to be. Even Julian's groomsmen were giggling as she went by. And for a moment, I lost my air, because my chest was constricted. My ears rang with fire as I gazed down at my plate. The lamb was now cold, the wine suddenly too sharp in my throat, and the embarrassment. I wanted to go away. I wanted to vanish. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded, as though I knew about it, and contrived a tight, bitter smile. I lifted my glass to no one in particular and took a long, leisurely sip of my drink, as if I was strong enough to let it go. My face flushed, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I stared straight ahead at Mira. My hands were shaking, but steady, as she returned the microphone to the DJ, who was beaming as if she had just cracked the year's biggest joke. She made fun of me, because she had choreographed the scene. This was the pinnacle of her performance. And I considered standing. I considered approaching directly, because I was the twist ending everyone was supposed to laugh at. I could have thrown my drink in her face,